This episode is brought to you in part by Chip Wallen, one of our great Patreon supporters. To learn more about how you can support the podcast through Patreon, please stay tuned for the end of the episode.
Carry me back to old Virginia. Carry me back to old Virginia.
The colony was growing. Settlers were flooding into the many newly established plantations along the James River. Business ventures started to turn profits, and locals had established representative government. Women were also arriving, and families were subsequently begun. Relations with the Powhatan tribes had been peaceful for almost 8 years by 1622. Regardless of the political pressures taking place back home, Virginia finally seemed like a viable colonial venture. But that all changed by late morning, March 22nd, 1622.
I sharpen my knife, sweep under the sofa. I take a bath with Bob in the cup of rye. The drink doesn't kill.
Peace between the English and Powhatan tribes came about when Pocahontas and John Rolfe married in April 1614. Powhatan didn't attend the wedding, but other members of the family did. Either way, the relationship between the Indians and the English began changing at this point in time. Until that historic union, the English and Powhatans had been locked in a deadly struggle that ebbed and flowed for 4 years. The Powhatans seemed certain to snuff out the English presence, but Powhatan puzzlingly never turned the final screws, much to his brother Opechancanoug's annoyance. So when Thomas Dale arrived on the scene in 1611, the English began fighting back with devastating effect, and the Powhatans began retreating slowly out of their traditionally held lands along the James River. Such retreats were not uncommon, especially since the Powhatan tribes often enjoyed success in battle at other lesser tribes' expense. Now it was their turn to taste defeat. However, Powhatan still had enough influence to harm the English indirectly. Meanwhile, Opechancanough, the powerful chieftain, was held on a leash. He was certainly ready to spill English blood. But that chance never really came before 1614. Marriage had changed the situation, but it didn't change internal reality. Opechancanough hated the English. Yet instead of letting that hatred control him, the powerful leader bided his time and laid out an incredibly masterful plan that took years to fully enact.
That's the trouble with home. What I owe is my own. That's the trouble with home. I walk under the moon, out of step with the asteroids, and I follow the brightest shadow. Cloistered strip shows down my moon, and at the end of the night.
When Powhatan died in 1618, Opechancanough became one step closer to the supreme tribal authority that he had sought. But he still had to wait for another of Powhatan's brothers, Opechancanough, to die before he could gain official control. Either way, Opechancanough was such a weak-willed man that Opechancanough was already in full power anyway. During that Powhatan power change, Opechancanough skillfully maneuvered his way into English hearts. He often happily visited Jamestown, and even told them that he wanted to become a Christian like his famous niece had done. The English took almost everything that Opechancanough had said at face value, which showed that the Indian had gained complete English trust. The English even gave him presents. None more fascinating to the Indian than the English-styled house, with which Opechancanough was excited about the door. He was said to be seen locking and unlocking it 100 times a day. The times certainly did seem peaceful, and that peace seemed to extend to the battlefield as well. One of Opechancanoug's most trusted warriors, Namatanau, known to the English as Jack of the Feather, because of his loud, feather-filled battle costume, had petitioned George Yardley for 8 to 10 Englishmen to assist in a battle against the traditional Powhatan enemy, the Monacans. Yardley gave his permission, and the English helped fight the Powhatan's battle. By the time Francis Wyatt replaced George Yardley as the new governor in November 1621, it seemed that the relations were as strong as ever, and Wyatt sought to strengthen them even further by encouraging more cohabitation between the two peoples. Opechancanough agreed, and restated his viewpoint that the Christian way seemed to be the right way. But those peaceful relations were put to the test early in March 1622, after Namatanoo was shot to death. He had visited a plantation owned by someone named Morgan, and exchanged goods with him. A few days later, Namatanoo returned to the plantation wearing Morgan's hat, and asked where the plantation's master was. Upon seeing their master's hat on the Indian's head, plantation workers attempted to arrest the Indian so that he could be tried for murder. But during the struggle, Namatanoo was shot dead, and news quickly spread throughout the colony. Opechancanough, for his part, grievously took the news, but told the English that peace would remain. Revenge would not be sought. The sky should sooner fall than peace be broken. Nothing would change. But something certainly had changed. Opechancanough no longer wished to be called by that name. He had changed it to Mangopesamon. Opechancanough also changed his name to Sasalpin. But the English at that time had no idea what any of this meant, and just thought it another cultural oddity. Had they known, they certainly would have taken notice, and acted differently as a result, because Indian wrath had finally reached the tipping point, and the name changes signaled that an attack against the English was now being put into motion.
Save the barkeep and his broom. That's the trouble with home. What I owe is my own. That's the trouble with home. Oh, well, I can't see. That's the trouble with home.
For quite some time before March 1622, Opechancanough had been orchestrating an anti-English Indian alliance behind unsuspecting English backs. The entire plan hinged upon the English being lulled into a false sense of security that was created by amicable relationships throughout the expanding Virginia colony. The plan worked. Except that one Indian boy named Chanco, who had truly converted to Christianity, and indeed loved his English benefactor, William Perry, a tobacco planter living on Richard Pace's plantation, alerted the Englishmen of the planned attack. Chanco was tipped off when an Indian hunter came to visit Richard Pace on March 21st in what seemed to be a normal, friendly encounter. The plantation men had dinner with the hunter and invited him to spend the night. During the course of the evening, the hunter told Chanco about the imminent attack. Further, Chanco was encouraged to kill Pace and William Perry that evening in advance of the next day's hostilities. The Indian boy's mind was uneasy with what he had just heard, and instead of killing his friends, he warned them. Pace and his men quickly fortified their houses and rowed across the James River to Jamestown to alert Governor Wyatt. Chanco's wasn't the first such warning, as the Laughing King and Thomas Savage warned of an impending attack earlier in the year. Yardley stepped up watches, but otherwise he didn't believe the warnings. Governor Wyatt also had no cause for concern at this first warning, and continued business as usual after he took over in November 1621. Chanco's newest warning, however, was spread as quickly as possible throughout the colony and reached Jamestown within a few hours. But spreading news along a 100-mile stretch of land in a few hours was impossible in 1622 Virginia. Only some of the nearby plantations could ready their defenses in enough time. But they didn't have enough time. On the morning of March 22nd, the colonists awoke to conduct business as usual. When more than 500 Indians began arriving across the colonial landscape, there was mostly no cause for alarm. Everything was so normal that men ate breakfast together, worked farms together, and sold goods together. The only thing really out of the ordinary was how many Indians were on hand across the colony that morning. But the English really paid no heed to the influx, and in fact offered their boats to be used by the Indians who needed help crossing Virginia's many waterways. Then sometime before noon, peace was disrupted when the Indians pulled out their weapons or picked up farm tools and began bludgeoning the completely unaware English settlers, man and woman, child and adult, elderly and infant, to death.
I'm a poor host for goblins and ghosts. And skeletons say they'll stay, but they all dance away. You promise you're mine, run my hand down your spine and say Braille doesn't lie. And that's the trouble with home. Oh, I still feel alone. That's the trouble with home. Oh, and I can't say that's the trouble with home. Oh, I still feel alone.
Most never saw their death coming, as the terror was swift and accurate. Those who tried to run away were cut down with arrows, and no one was safe. Powerful men such as Nathaniel Powell, who had been in Virginia since 1607 and survived so much hardship up until that time, finally succumbed to Virginia's brutality during this attack. He, along with his family, were hacked to pieces and their heads were cut off. George Thorpe, another very prominent settler, who was involved with the Berkeley 100 venture, distilled the first corn whiskey on that plantation, and was tasked with educating Indians at Henricus College, also fell during the attack. He was found numbered among those slaughtered at the Berkeley 100 soon after he had in fact met with Opechancanough. Thorpe was even warned about his coming death, but he paid it no heed, like so many others who died that day. Even John Rolfe might have died on the day, but history simply doesn't know for sure. All we know is that Rolfe's name ceases to be mentioned soon after March 1622. Opechancanoug's plan seemed to be perfect, and it almost was. He had hoped to destroy the English presence entirely, and started by crushing Henricus and then moved down through Charles City. Meanwhile, another front was opened when nearby Indians moved against Bennett's Welcome, which had been established on the south side of the James River not too long before the attacks began. Settlers at Bennett's Welcome first saw one of their own wives slaughtered before her husband Baldwin rushed out of his house firing his gun to scare the murderous band away. The Indians then moved to where they believed Ralph Haymore to have been, and tried to lure the captain out of hiding. When Haymore didn't emerge, the Indians became very angry and lit a nearby tobacco barn ablaze. The English then ran out of the house to quench the flames, but they didn't make it to the barn before they were all shot down and had their brains beaten out. Ralph's brother Thomas remained unwittingly inside the house, but when he heard the commotion going on outside, he emerged to see what was taking place and was shot in the back by an arrow. He fell back into the house where a frightened servant shot a pistol that scared the Indians back into the woods. Thomas and the servant then managed to safely make their way to Baldwin's house, where the settler was trying to save his mortally wounded wife. It wasn't long before the Indians came back out of the woods to destroy house after house in search of Ralph Haymore, who was eventually found hunting on the plantation. When he realized what was taking place, Haymore and his men retreated to his unfinished house, where they rounded up farm tools and mounted a counterattack that scattered the Indian band. The attack was done, for now. Bennett's Welcome suffered tremendous losses. 53 settlers were killed, and the plantation was abandoned for a short time until a fort could be built nearby and the Warascoyak tribe could be cleared from the area. Many of the 80 or so other newly formed plantations suffered similar losses on the day, and one suffered most severely, Wolstenholme Town at Martin's 100. The previously thriving 1618 plantation had lost 50 settlers on the day, and perhaps a total of 77 within a few days after the attack. The devastation was so complete that only 2 houses and a part of the plantation's church remained after the attack. Henricus, the Fallen Creek Ironworks, Berkeley 100, Smith's 100, and a score of other plantations fell into ruin as the remaining settlers had to retreat to Jamestown for safety. Many of those plantations, such as Henricus, never recovered. In all, 347, slightly more than a quarter of Virginia's 1622 population, died that day. 20 women were taken captive, most of the plantations closer to the falls were abandoned, and Virginia was once again completely centered upon Jamestown. War was once again in the air. It took time for news of these events to reach the English shores, but when that news did arrive, it came at a most inopportune time. The very same time that the much-maligned Edwin Sandys and his inner circle were trying to save the Virginia Company against increasing royal pressure. Maybe Sandys and the Virginia Company could have succeeded had the March 1622 Indian raid not occurred. But it did happen. And because it happened, the Virginia Company's demise was now certain. Thank you again for supporting the podcast. It's greatly appreciated. Please continue to spread the word and help this colony to keep growing. Start by following us on your favorite podcast provider, like us on Facebook, and visit the website. Sharing episodes and other work is the best way to expand the community. Another way to greatly aid the podcast is by providing feedback on iTunes. If you have yet to do so, please take a few minutes and leave us a comment. Doing so helps bring exposure in the iTunes network. If you would like to do more, please consider supporting the podcast like Chip Wallen has done on Patreon. Links can be found on the website, or one can visit the campaign at patreon.com/VAHISPod to see the choices and rewards being offered for your support. Please join me next time as we detail the steps about how Virginia became a royal colony.
Mas tudo bate despedido dos embazes.